My name is Jessica Matthews, and I'm president of the Carnegie Endowment. And I apologize for the Washington, not only the weather, but the fact that whenever it snows here, the entire city folds up like a house of cards and closes down. I can't really think of a worse day for this to have happened than today, because this conference is one on which we have put an enormous amount of work, an enormous amount of excitement, and an enormous amount of interest in this city, as well as inside Carnegie, which matters less, but widely in the discussions that you all were to lead. So we felt that since you were here and since so many people had traveled so far to join us, that we would transform our plans for the day into a small roundtable discussion, film it, and produce a conference report so that we can share the conversations with as wide an audience as we can reach online, which is quite wide. So my apologies for the weather. My thanks to all of you for coming. It means a great deal to our work and to the work of this project, and my interest in what goes forward. I should say, I want to say one other word. I'm in the middle upstairs of a conference call with members of the Carnegie board. And so I dropped off for a few minutes, explained to them what I was doing. I will run upstairs and finish that, and then I will return. I just wanted, by way of introduction, that you all probably don't need. But I can remember very clearly as a student, wondering as we studied history, whether when you discussed major turning points in history, the beginning of new eras, the end of eras, I always used to wonder whether the people who were living through them understood this was a historic turning point. This was a new era. And I think it's a fair enough question in this one. I think none of us have any doubt that this is an historic moment for the Middle East. But the question that maybe is the core of what we're going to be discussing today is what will it be known as? What will its outcome be? What will and in particular, will it be, as Marwan has argued in his new book, will it be seen as the beginning of a great region-wide battle for pluralism? And that is the core of the discussion that we had planned for today. Maybe he's wrong. Maybe he's right. History will tell us. But today's discussion is meant to be an early pulse taking on this event of such tremendous importance. So with that, let me turn it over to Marwan.
Thank you very much, Jessica, and thank you all for coming. Again, apologies once again for this arrangement. This is probably something new that we're trying, but I hope it will work. We do plan to videotape this, but also have it available in an audio format online, and also produce a conference report based on short papers that we've already asked all of you to present to us. So I think in the end it hopefully will work out better than it looks today. We have 4 sessions today to talk about different sides of the Arab uprisings and what has transpired so far. What I would like to propose is that we devote maybe half an hour to each session in which the participants and the moderators can at least try to put across their, most important points. and have a break for lunch as well. I say half an hour because if we go much beyond 2 hours, I doubt that people will have the patience to maybe look at all of this. But we can take it as you like. We have all day here, but I'm just cognizant of the weather, and some of us will have to go home. It doesn't look too bad so far, but who knows? And so the 4 sessions that we envisaged for the day was one on social justice and citizens' rights. And I must say here that we are missing some people who intended to come, the Tunisians for sure, who are voting on the constitution today, and so they have ended up not being able to come. Did Hussam come from Egypt? Hussam Bahgat is a human rights activist who was also supposed to be with us. But Michelle will moderate the first session on social justice and citizen rights and what is to be expected so far. And then another session on political Islam and the changes that are happening in the region. We have representatives from several Islamist parties in the Arab world, from Egypt. We are supposed to have a representative of the Noor also party. I hope he makes it. We also have a sitting minister in the Moroccan government, an ex-Carnegie scholar, who also can tell us about a different experience than the one that Egypt went through. We were hoping to also hear from the Tunisians about their experience, but as I said, it was not possible. And then the third session, we're going to have a discussion on emerging political forces in the Arab world, those forces that have started to emerge after the Arab uprisings, and what challenges are they facing. This is going to be moderated by Tom Carruthers, who will also really explain to us the experiences of political parties, emerging political parties, not just in the Arab world, but around the world, and what comparisons and what similarities and differences can we expect to learn from this new experience. And then finally, we will have a session on the rising sectarianism in the Arab world, the Sunni-Shiite divide in particular, but sectarianism in general. And we have a number of people who will talk about this. This session will be moderated by Fred Weary. With that, let me not take more time and ask Michelle to start the first session. This is an informal setting, so we will probably have a chance to talk about all the issues as long as you are aware of time and the need for us to basically be a bit disciplined so that we can reach the largest number of people possible. Thank you. Michelle.
Thank you, Marwan. Well, thanks for being here on this cold and snowy day, but I think that speaking about social justice and citizen rights should warm up the room nicely. I'm so pleased that Marwan chose to begin this conference with this session, because after all, if we think about pluralism and changing political systems and changing economic systems and so forth, what is it all about? It's for people to get their rights. It's for there to be a distribution of the goods in society and the economic benefits that people feel is just, and it's for citizens to be able to call their governments to account and change their governments if they are not, if the governments are not providing the rights and so forth that citizens were looking for. So we have a very short session to discuss this. I'm delighted to welcome our two panelists, our abdul-ghani al-iryani from Yemen and Hussam Bahgat. Hussam, please take your time and get your coffee from Egypt. two very prominent and long-standing activists in the field of human rights whose work and whose courage I respect very much. I asked each of them to make very brief remarks on a few issues, and here's the questions I asked them. So starting off with Yemen and Egypt, and then I hope we can broaden the conversation to other countries. We have participants from a number of other countries here. The status of citizens' rights in your country from a formal legal point of view, is it better, worse, or the same now as it was 3 years ago when all these political changes started happening? So the formal status of citizens' rights, to what extent are these rights that are on paper likely to be implemented in reality? And what challenges do they face? And the third thing is, what about the status of organizations that promote rights and freedoms in your countries? How is it now compared to what it was a few years ago? What is the ability of those organizations, rights organizations, to influence government decisions, the formation of laws, and so forth, and also citizens' attitudes about these issues? So I'm going to ask Abdul-ghani maybe to begin with just 5 minutes of your thoughts on this, and then we'll turn to Hussam and open it up to everyone.
Sure. Thank you. And I limit my comments to the specific case of Yemen. Yemen has been very different from the rest of the Arab Spring in that we had, number one, the greatest number of challenges in backwardness, lack of economic growth, low level of education, urbanization, internet penetration. We had we were the country that was closest to state failure, as per, obviously, the Carnegie criteria. And yet, Yemenis actually enjoyed a much higher degree of freedom and citizenship rights than in most other Arab countries, not because those who demand those rights are stronger in Yemen. It's because those who repress those rights are weaker in Yemen. The weakness of the central government in Yemen allowed a margin of freedom for Yemenis that is to be only aspired to in most other Arab countries. Now, we had one huge jump, one huge step forward in 1990 in the unification of the two Yemens, which was predicated on opening the political space to allow for the accommodation of two formerly ruling parties in the two countries. And that's where we had our first multi-party system, regular elections, guaranteed free speech. Of course, all of those were on paper in the beginning. They were practiced aggressively. But then, of course, as time went on, the regime began to roll that back as much as it could by practice and even sometimes by legal means as well. The Yemenis got more rights in 1990 than they had even aspired to. And that was a historical anomaly, so you can't really measure it for other countries. And today, we have still a huge margin of freedoms compared to other countries, but the question is the implementation. Regimes, rather than trying to change the laws, they just decided to ignore them. And they found ways to run the country without reference to the law. Our challenge today is how to establish the rule of law. That is really the challenge. Not getting the rights on paper, but having them actually enforced and implemented. Today, we just concluded the National Dialogue Conference, which gave us even a bigger step forward. We may end up with one of the best constitutions in the region, maybe in the third world. And then that will be even greater challenge of how to implement that and to ensure that we first build the state and then establish the rule of law within it. And that's the real challenge for Yemen. Thank you.
Thank you. Abdul, could you add just something briefly about organizations in Yemen, civil society and other organizations, and how is their status and their role today compared to, a few years ago?
The establishment of NGOs in Yemen started again in 1990 with unification and the opening up of that political space. But for quite a period of time, they remained donor-driven. So they were looking at the issues that donors are more likely to fund. And that is, of course, with the exception of political parties, which had ideological agendas as well. I think that the civil society today is becoming a real force, and it has contributed and been recognized by the National Dialogue and has contributed quite a bit to the National Dialogue Conference. And I think it will be the basis of the new state, because the government, now that we are going into a very high level of decentralization, will no longer be able to control the entire society and will have to refer most of the functions of social organization to NGOs. So I think we have a very promising future in terms of NGOs.
But are such organizations dependent on external support, financial support, and so forth still? Able to get support from inside?
Not yet. You see, in the absence of strong strong middle class, civil society will always be donor-driven. However, what we can see now is the gap between traditional civil society and modern donor-driven civil society narrowing slowly, and we can have a hybrid that will have more independence from donors and more reliance on the local communities. And we see that in Yemen in terms of organizing water resources, in terms of organizing basic services at the community level. And the water user associations in Yemen are the most successful form of NGOs. So I think they will be fine.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, then I'd like to turn the floor over to Hussam Bahgat from the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights for his comments on the situation in Egypt. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. So let me start by addressing the first question, which is whether, on paper, Egyptians have more legal protection, at least, or formal protection of individual rights since the ouster of Mubarak. Now, the picture, of course, is very mixed because we've had several regimes in the last 3 years, clearly, and for most of the last 3 years, we did not have elected parliaments as well as them. So we didn't really have a proper or coherent or transparent legislative process or lawmaking process. Whether it's under the year and a half of rule by the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces or during the Morsi 1 year or during the 5 months of elected parliament that we had between January and May of 2012, or now with the July 3rd arrangement, each of these regimes had a somewhat mixed record in terms of enshrining more protections for rights. One of the first things that the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces did, for instance, was in March of 2011, so 1 month into its control of the country, is issue a SCAF decree in the name of Tantawi, the Minister of Defense and acting head of state at the time, banning all labor protests and banning all public protests and labor strikes. Attempted to enforce it at least once against striking workers of an oil company by referring them to a military court, and then in the face of growing protests realized that it's going to be a joke if they decide to actually invoke and implement this decree, and so it became a non-law, pretty much like the enforcement of laws under Mubarak, where everything on the books was very restrictive, but the enforcement was very chancy. That is a lesson that the current authorities have learned, and they often say this publicly, is that they learned from the downfall of Mubarak, Tantawi, and Morsi that there can be no compromises. And if they discuss a law, then they have to go ahead with issuing it. If they issue it, then they have to enforce it, and they have to start by the least likely targets of enforcement. And that's why we see really the most notable and prominent leaders of the protest movement are the first to be convicted under the protest law, which is really a reversal of established rules, if one can talk about established rules in recent Egyptian history. But at the same time, in the first months of SCAF rule, we have seen almost unhindered right to exercise of the right to organize. So all political parties that applied for a permit got registered. All independent labor unions were recognized. Now, the law recognizing them was never issued. It was presented to SCAF by the Sharaf cabinet, but it was never issued. But at least the Sharaf cabinet moved to legalize the presence of independent labor unions, probably for the first time since 1957. There was no changes to the status of NGOs, but of course, because that was seen as part of the conspiracy that brought down Mubarak, and as a result, the law that is in place is still the Mubarak law, but mostly in terms of the right to organize, unionize, form anything and call it anything, call it a committee or a forum, or but also access to public spaces in general, and especially outside of Cairo. During the honeymoon that we enjoyed, probably from the appointment of the Sharaf cabinet in March until the enforcement of SCAF's control in the summer of 2011, ordinary citizens also opened up, government buildings like cultural palaces and youth centers and in village centers, and they would organize their own public discussions of politics and rights and invite people like us to villages in Aswan to talk to people about organizing and about how to protect the revolution. That was not really something that was codified in any laws that offered protection for organizing, except for political parties. That was the one law that really constituted a major formal change of the rules from the Mubarak time to the SCAF time. But when the parliament was elected in January of 2012, the priority of the majority, both the the Freedom and Justice Party and the Noor Party, was to was to not change any of the rules, was to send comforting message to the military that they can be trusted with governance, that they can be trusted with either the presidency or at least forming the cabinet and appointing a prime minister. And as a result, there was absolutely no move to enshrine more rights or to change the political structure in a way that would, for instance, start a process of security sector reform or more civilian oversight of the military, or even things that have always been pet issues for the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamists, like military trials of civilians. None of these were touched because that's a parliament that was intended primarily to prepare the ground for a more smooth integration of the Brotherhood into the political system. When Morsi was elected and had sole lawmaking powers, he did not really use these powers. His aides at the time told us that he wanted to issue executive decrees more than laws because he doesn't want to be accused of overreach or of overusing his lawmaking powers. And so he used executive decree powers to set up the fact-finding commission looking at protester killings under SCAF, or to recommend pardons of prisoners, particularly civilians convicted by military courts. Until suddenly, of course, he did the overreach in November and appointed the Shura Council as the lawmaking power, but it was already in a time. I mean, the political crisis had already started, and so the Shura Council became our enemy, became the enemy of human rights, really. All of the laws that were discussed at the Shura Council from that moment in November until the ouster of Morsi in June were laws that were meant to cement the power of the Muslim Brotherhood. So laws that would, forcibly retire 3,000 judges, or establish new strict rules for the media, or ban protests. They were the first, of course, to promote the protest law that was ultimately issued by the new authorities, a negative and restrictive NGO law. It was really a parliament that was meant to protect the Brotherhood from the opposition, because the secular opposition was seen as the enemy, not the military or the police. And finally, we get to, as you see, of course, there are no very broad statements to be made in answer to your question. But finally, if we get to the current authorities, there is from the appointment of this cabinet, the Biblawi cabinet, which has the power to recommend legislation to the interim president, who has the power to unanimously issue laws, it became very clear that the freedom agenda became was put on a back burner. Even when the Deputy Prime Minister Ziyad Bahauddin recommended a full political agenda that included some laws. It included particularly a transitional justice law, the NGO law, and a freedom of information law. And that was signed by all ministers, including Sisi, and it became a government program, but it was killed on the same day, of course, and they unleashed the security agencies, I assume, unleashed the attack on the Deputy Prime Minister as a person for having proposed this plan that theoretically became a government plan, but it was not enforced at all. And instead, we saw laws like removing the cap on pretrial detention, for instance, that was ironically established under Mubarak as a reformist movement in 2008. That was removed by the interim president. We saw the protest law, and then we saw representatives of the General Intelligence Service publicly saying that it is the view of General Intelligence that important laws like NGO law or the Freedom of Information law should wait until there is an elected parliament, because these are laws that have a deep impact on the exercise of political and individual rights, which is a position that they did not, of course, keep when it came to protest laws or pretrial detentions. So, I'm sorry, to sum up this very complicated picture, it doesn't matter, really. It doesn't matter because it depends ultimately on the political environment and how much space there is for dissent or for the exercise of these rights, and the kind of political system that existed, which sometimes actually had more checks and balances in the absence of an elected parliament than it did when there was an elected parliament. And ultimately, it also depends on whether or not the judiciary is willing to enforce these laws and to hold the government accountable to them. And we were surprised that under SCAF, for instance, in the height of popularity of the military, we could still go to court and get a binding decision to allow Egyptians abroad to vote for the first time in 2011. We could go to the administrative court and get a binding decision banning virginity tests, quote unquote, against female prisoners in military jails. Under Morsi, the courts were obviously even more willing to hear our cases and sometimes hold the government accountable. in our cases. After June 30th, the judges have willingly, just like the media, decided that their role is to protect the state from the existential threat of the opposition. And as a result, we're seeing like almost no court orders that are not in favor of the new authorities.
Thank you, Hussam, and thanks for bringing in the role of the judiciary at the end, because they have played a very notable part in the past years regarding human rights and citizens' rights in Egypt. Well, as the panel is very short, I would love to follow up with some questions, but I'm going to allow you to do so instead. I would welcome questions, comments, and so forth from the other participants, either related to what's been said already or comparative discussion regarding other countries in the region. Who would like to begin? Well,
so it's a question. So there is a narrative in Egypt, for example, and it came a little bit through the presentation on Yemen as well, that in fact there isn't the popular platform for individual rights, that it's not something that the common average person values above other considerations, and that what security services are doing is merely tapping into that vein. You've had extensive experience, obviously, in Egypt. Do you agree with that assessment, that the al-ardiyya al-sha'biyya is the popular kind of mood does not value human rights, particularly when it's placed, or individual rights, particularly when it's placed in contradistinction to security? Or do you think that's an imposed narrative that's not accurate?
Now, I can only answer anecdotally, again, from experience. During that period that I call the honeymoon, so between February, the ouster of Mubarak, and July, August, when SCAF started to sideline the cabinet after the second Sharaf cabinet reshuffle and started issuing hostile statements against April 6th and against sort of the revolutionary youth, which previously used to be revered and of course showered in compliments, etc. During that period, a 6 months period when there was no active effort by the security agencies to restrict our movement and to really vilify those that campaigned for freedoms and rights, there were two things that I remember from that period. One is that we could, for the first time, travel around the country, our own country, and that was not possible before. So previously, under Mubarak, our researchers would literally have to be smuggled from home to home if they wanted to go to the site in the aftermath of a sectarian clash between Muslims and Christians and collect testimonies of researchers, etc., because it was only a matter of time before the state security officer found out that we were in the village, came and either arrested the researchers or escorted them outside of the place. That was not the case in the first few months of 2011. We could travel around the country. We had access to government officials, but also access to the people and access to public places, like I said, for campaigning and public outreach and organizing, etc. And people really fully embraced us. And it was the only time that I remember when we were not constantly under attack, at least in the public media, as enemies of the state. And I could feel how that changed the people's willingness to receive us and engage us on our issues. It doesn't mean that they agreed with everything we had to say, but at least there was an open space, a marketplace of ideas, as it were. The second thing that I remember from that period is that, I remember meeting young people that were either part of the April 6 or Al-Baradai's campaign or different youth coalitions that would be formed at the level of a village or a town or a markaz, a district, and would people would call themselves the Revolutionary Coalition of Idfu, or the Youth of the Revolution of Aswan, or the Popular Committee of Alexandria. And these people had the ability, I swear, to walk into the office of the governor and with due respect say, I am one of the revolutionary youth, and I am here because we have noticed that there is a problem of shortage of bread in the village, and we would like to fix this problem. We would like to help you fix this problem. So people from April 6th, for instance, would go to Aswan and say, we are going to appoint monitors, just like election monitors, at all the bakeries that used subsidized flour in order to prevent the smuggling of government-subsidized flour and make sure that people got their quota of bread. People in another place would go and say, so there's a lack of propane gas canisters, and we are going to receive them from the government, and we will distribute them. We will take over the distribution in order to make sure that people had them. And all of this came to an abrupt end when the government started the crackdown. It was a time, of course, I'm romanticizing it a bit for the purpose of this argument, but it was the only time that I remember when you could objectively at least see how much popular support there was for our issues, and how much there was, of course, an unprecedented hike in civic engagement and volunteerism and organizing that we did not see. It was in April, May that the government decided to set up suddenly a fact-finding committee to look into the funding of NGOs of 2011. By the summer of that year, the government campaign, the conspiracy narrative that had always existed secretly, started to be used publicly, and advanced the role of America and the Brotherhood and Hamas and Iran, Hezbollah, all of these people coming together and bringing down the regime. And by the spring, the public prosecutor had already started the investigations, and the public space had been sort of almost confiscated again by the state. And since then, we have been just on the defense, really, just defending our very existence. So the short answer to your question is that, when there was no public media and propaganda campaign and a security crackdown and restrictions on us, we did not feel that people necessarily, opposed ideas of democratic oversight or accountability or transitional justice or even individual liberties. The problem is it was a very, very brief experiment, and it would be... it would be difficult, really, to build lasting, sort of sweeping statements based on such a brief experiment.
Hossam, just very, very brief follow-up. So is it your view that the campaign against foreign funding for NGOs and so forth started in response to the kind of local organization and initiative and so forth that you are talking about was going on in those months between February and May or so?
It's, of course, several factors contributed to the crackdown. The problem was that now we know, because we have documents that show that during the 18 days of revolt against Mubarak, the correspondence received, for instance, the correspondence sent from the foreign minister to the head of state security, containing the information they had in February of 2011 during the protests when Mubarak was still in place, that they were receiving from their ambassador in Ramallah, for instance, was that Hamas had infiltrated Egypt. Hamas elements were seen in Tahrir Square to provide aid to the Muslim Brotherhood. The deposition of Omar Suleiman months after the ouster of Mubarak, private and sworn statement, you would see that in response to a question by the prosecutor in Mubarak's trial about what happened on January 25th, his answer is that there was April 6th and Al-Baradei National Association for Change receiving support from the U.S. government through organizations, and he names International Republican Institute, NDI, and Freedom House. And then there was the Muslim Brotherhood with support from Hamas and Hezbollah coming together and agitating the people and using real grievances, but using them to undermine the regime and bring it down. So from the very beginning, from the beginning of the protest, they felt that they needed to go after both the organizations that provided activists with some specialist training in how to agitate and how to use public anger to bring down the regime, but also how to particularly go after people like April 6 and like these youth organizations. But it was only one piece of the big, grand conspiracy narrative of America using both the civil activists and its new, more open relations with the Muslim Brotherhood to undermine the system.
Thank you, Hussam. Steve Heidemann.
Sure. Thank you very much. I wanted to pick up on a different topic, one that abdul-ghani raised, because I really think you pointed to one of the central dilemmas of pluralism, and Yemen is a very good example of it. And that is this observation you made that in many respects it was state weakness that permitted the expression of citizenship, which perhaps more broadly, more deeply than in contexts in which states were stronger. And yet it is at the same time the weakness of states that constrain the exercise of citizenship and create this gap between the formal and the informal, which we see across the region. And that really is quite a critical dilemma, because in many respects, right now, you have only recourse to institutions which are repressive, exclusionary, to defend against what are perceived to be threats to pluralism. In the Egyptian case, I think there were many secularists who perceived of the Morsi government as a threat to pluralism, and yet clearly those institutions cannot be seen as in any meaningful way defending pluralism, and so I wonder if within the Yemen context there are any understanding or any ideas or arguments about how to resolve this dilemma, about what you do to narrow this gap, and what you do to constrain states perhaps in ways that permit them to defend pluralism without trespassing on liberties.
Hold that thought for just a moment. I want to allow Tom Carruthers to ask his question as well, and then we'll let both of you say a few words to end.
Thanks, Michelle. This is actually a general question that could apply to many countries that have been experiencing change. I thought about it, Hussam, in relation to Egypt, so maybe you could comment, but I think it's in a way the central question of this panel. Stepping back from a comparative perspective and looking at the outburst of political change in the Arab world in the last 3 years, behind it, of course, is this powerful narrative of the search for social justice, the frustration, the anger, etc. Yet compared to when you look at the driving impulse or narrative of political change in other regions, Central and Eastern Europe, Asia in the 1980s, Latin America in the 1980s, Africa in the 1990s, what's so striking is the difficulty of translating that impulse into programmatic action. Now, the reasons for that are fairly obvious. To get to social justice, you'd have to break up a lot of vested interests, probably have to go through some austerity, and so forth. But what I'm wondering, Hussam, is, as you say, cycling through these different political cycles in Egypt in the last 3 years, this narrative keeps getting pushed down the road and not at all addressed, let alone achieved in any small way. How is the new political structure or authorities going to face this? Because if they don't handle it either in any successful way, they'll meet the same fate as their predecessors. They know that at some level, yet the obstacles are enormous. And so, in a sense, we picture the social justice narrative as this kind of large beach ball being pushed ahead of the thing. Where is it now? What's going to happen in the next year or two with it? There are, of course, choices. You can move to demagoguery, and create a Hugo Chavez-style social justice and just give away a lot of money. You can, there are different ways you can respond to that. But where do you think it'll go? Where is this narrative now in Egypt?
Okay, thank you, Tom. Great. So I'll give each of our panelists a few minutes to.
I think both questions are connected, and so I'll answer both of them. In Yemen is an extreme case of frontier state. And in such a system, the society is so weak, and the state, with its weakness, still so much more powerful, and so much economically, both economically and militarily and politically. So the possibility of having a democratic system in the frontier state is almost nil. in Yemen, we have actually formulated a formula to ensure that we avoid this problem by creating concrete balances, checks and balances within a federal system where control over political power and economic power is diffused. So, for example, we have established that the natural resources, the sovereign resources, will be controlled by the state, by the state government, and the federal government will have a share and will have the right to participate in its control, but it is owned by the state. Now, diffusing economic power and diffusing political power, I think, will create the necessary checks and balances that allow for the establishment and flourishing of civil rights. And we have no plan. We don't have a program on how to get those rights forward. But we have a very good program on how to control the powers of the state. We have, right now we have just produced 200 pages of a shopping spree of constraints on political power. The presidents, prime ministers, ministers cannot have any member of their families anywhere near them, not in public office and not in the private sector. We have established very, very good, I think, clause to try holders of high office. We have established independent institutions to oversee and punish, if necessary, holders of political power. We have created an affirmative action regime that ensures 30% for women and ensures equal opportunity for everyone, all kinds of minorities. Of course, we'll have to define what minority means, but we are in that direction. We have, I think, established very good controls. Police control is now in the state hand, so the local police and the district hand. So the local police will be independent of the state, of the federal state. I think we have controlled political power, and the next thing is how to, having created that political space, how to then build freedoms and citizens' rights in that political space that allows it to grow.
Thank you. The question about difficulty of translating the impulse from social justice into
That's a difficult question to answer, obviously. But again, I answer from my own experience, from our recent experience. Social justice has traditionally tended to, the social justice agenda usually step in and save us when the political reform agenda fails or when we think it's failed. I remember in 2005 we had a year, of course, of what was called at the time the Arab Spring, and that came to an end in 2007 in Egypt and the rest of the region, and we felt a complete defeat in 2007. Mubarak had passed through sweeping amendments to the Constitution, 34 articles of the Constitution, there were violent breakdowns of protests, but also the judges' movement was co-opted, and independent journalists were being showered with criminal complaints of insulting the ruling party or insulting Mubarak or speculating about his health, and NGOs were shut down in 2007 for the first time, human rights NGOs, and we felt that whatever we had hope, we came so close of achieving reform, and we lost. And suddenly, with the end of this political reform movement, 2007 was the year when we had the largest number of labor strikes in the history of the 100-year-old labor movement in Egypt, and an explosion of social and economic protests where people would decide to cut the international road to, demand access to drinking water or, a safe passage to school for their children that were being hit by cars on their way to school every morning. And that kept really the pressure on. In 2010, in the aftermath of the parliamentary elections, again, we felt that it was a complete defeat. The Mubarak's party had won like 97% of the seats, etc. The mobilization that succeeded in January of 2011 was pretty much driven by social justice issues as much as by anger against the police. And I claim that it was more anger at corruption and social inequality than anger at the police brutality that brought people out on January 28th in particular, not just 25th. And so I feel that we're in a very similar moment now, that in both of these moments in 2007 and 2010, there was a very evident Egypt fatigue, that we've tried everything in Egypt. We can never get Egypt right. And, it's just, it's too big to fail, but also too big to fix. There's nothing is going to happen. Both. And I remember being in this city and people telling me, we've tried everything. We've tried public diplomacy, private diplomacy, there's just nothing that is working with Mubarak. And it is in these moments of the closure of the political process, the lack of political openings, as well as the fatigue and feeling that, there's nothing we can do, that really the social justice demands and the impact of social inequality, I think, surprises us. And I think that's what's going to happen here. How exactly it's going to depend on a number of questions. We're not going to get into them. But, how long will the Gulf financial support last? But also how willing will these Gulf states, how willing are they to keep spending money to, in their own terminology, subsidize the subsidies to build, to maintain or build some public confidence, public support for Sisi before Sisi has to make the difficult decisions. And the second is, when is the austerity agenda going to kick in, which is related to the first question. The advisors to the interim president say that it's almost inevitable that what's coming next is austerity and austere measures, and that's why we need Sisi to run, people say, because we need someone who is popular enough to force people to swallow these difficult political decisions. And finally, how much is this new constitution going to be respected? Because, it was remarkable. We have the first constitution now that has a provision that taxation should be progressive. And in the same month, we have the Minister of Finance announcing that by January 31st, the government is going to introduce a new value-added tax. Nothing at all related to the constitution that they just passed. The new constitution has numerical stipulations for how much of the GDP should go to health, education, and scientific research. It has some more checks and balances, actually, when it comes to budget making and government spending once a parliament is elected. And that could actually get interesting depending on whether or not we're going to start rebuilding the judiciary, or the judiciary is going to rebuild itself enough, whether or not the Constitutional Court is going to be restored after it's been merged with the presidency, and whether or not, of course, the parliament is going to be political at all, or if it's going to be just a rubber stamping parliament. But I think I wouldn't dismiss the constitution just passed as something completely trivial, because it actually has things that could show some surprises, in the same manner that the MB-driven constitution actually came back to haunt them on issues like the Sukuk law and the role of Al-Azhar and a few other issues that they did not expect are going to work against their interests. So I would say that social justice is going to be the most important player of events in 2014, and I expect surprises before the end of the year.
Well, thank you. making on an intriguing note, Hussam. Thank you very much. So I think we're going to end this panel now and move on to the next discussion, although I'm sure these issues of rights will continue to come out throughout the day. So thank you. Thank you very much, Abdul-Ghani and Hussam.
Thank you, Abdul-Ghani, Hussam, and Michelle.